And hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm very happy to be joined by Christine Wen. She leads the work on defending public goods against corporate tax breaks at Good Jobs First, a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. Her current research focuses on the impact of property tax abatements on K 12 education funding and adequacy and progressivity. She also actively works to promote local government transparency in tax spending, and she has collaborations with unions, journalists, policy organizations, government officials, and academics. Prior to that, she was a PhD in which she received in city and regional planning from Cornell University in 2019. So, welcome, Christine, to the podcast. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I think we'll before we go into the what your current work is, I think we might go a little bit into your history first. So you grew up in Vancouver and in China. I mean, is it right?
China and then Vancouver. Yeah, the other way around.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So first uh in China, and then you went to Vancouver, right? Something
Yes,
like
I
that.
was born in Beijing and I moved to Vancouver when I was 11.
Yeah, and yeah. So how was that transition to you? I mean, so I must assume it must be like your parents, found a job in Canada. I guess it was probably the main drive behind the move.
No, it wasn't employment based. I think Canada has like a different category of immigrants.
So it's like an investor visa or something like that.
Probably skill based, or at least that's what I hear them call it. I think it's if you have maybe certain. I'm not sure about it, so I could be wrong, but I think it's if you have like advanced degrees or anything like that.
I see. So how was the move like? I mean, was there like a big cultural shock? I mean, was it usual to sort of come into a new culture? I mean, something that you haven't experienced before. Yeah. So how was it like growing up?
Yeah, it was definitely not an easy transition. A lot of stuff to get used to, and I did not speak any English, so that made it harder. And my parents were also very nervous about it, so I could kind of feel like because they're also trying to figure out like kind of how to navigate this new sort of society and all its rules, and so kind of have just to go along with that, and yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I do have some in-laws who, also Chinese from Vancouver, and like you basically can live in a community that's entirely Chinese Canadian, so to speak, right? So you actually wouldn't have to, you know, intermingle as much as, like, say, if you grew up in like an East Coast city, right, where perhaps there would be much bigger racial diversity. So what was the socio-demographics in your neighborhood and uh, you grew up in?
It kind of varied because I moved around 3 or 4 times when I was there. So kind of, but it's mostly white. And I think my mom's in fact very fearful of my not integrating successfully. So I think in the beginning, at least, she took steps to actually keep ourselves from the Chinese community and mingle with the sort of the locals because she's worried I'm never going to learn English if I were put in like just a comfort zone of other Chinese speakers.
Yeah, yeah. So I think integration was sort of like a big motive force, basically, right? Yeah, growing up. And then so then after you finished high school, you went to Princeton University, correct? And
Yeah.
studied in physics. And so what was your determination of, like, you know choosing university, choosing major?
Oh, Well, I mean, for most of my life, I wanted to play the piano professionally. So it was kind of a last minute decision to not pursue that. And so didn't really had, I didn't really think too much about what I wanted to do with my life. So, and I was good at physics, so I chose physics. But I didn't think too much about like career prospects or you know, how I want to spend the 4 years. And so kind of just like stumble into it. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and then after you graduated, I must assume that then at that point you had to
Yeah, I
figure
wasn't gonna
something out
work.
that really fit your interest. So then you
Right.
went to Columbia. You studied urban planning.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that was
What a
also
shift!
sort of by accident. It wasn't a super conscious choice. I think it was something I was interested in definitely. But it was also because it was a relatively easy career transition in that it doesn't require any coursework, specialized coursework that I didn't have in from undergrad.
Yeah. So and you from there you studied groundwater levels in the U.S. So that was like your first like real research experience, correct?
I would say so. Yes. So I was. It started out being just like a summer thing, but then they asked me to stay on, sort of part time ish, over the next year to sort of finish the project that we started. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was definitely a great learning experience to work with so many lines of data, so like millions, because that's how many wells and spread over like almost a century of worth of data. So it's like working with large data set. And I was also kind of new to a lot of statistical analysis, and the software I used was MATLAB, and that was also new. So there's like learning a lot of new things, but it was great. Yeah.
Yeah, and but you also, I mean, so climate change, of course, is a big topic that relates to groundwater usage, right? And so the major finding, I must assume, is that the water tables are declining, especially in aquifers, which is where a lot of the you could say fresh water that's used in agriculture and for household use is sourced from. And I saw recently there was this one news report about Lake Mead, I think, which um, where a couple of states in the southwest, which is the driest parts of the country, are sourcing the groundwater from, and they're basically facing the lowest levels of uh, water. And yeah, so but then at the same time, what I found very interesting, they also showed in the news report that there were people uh, with like living in these neighborhoods, and they have this very luscious grass,
Mhm.
green grass, because they take the water, I guess, from that water table. But then if you go just slightly outside the neighborhood, like it basically looks like a desert, right? It's a completely, um, I guess, yellow brownish. Um, and and I guess I was just wondering, like, you know, is it really the best use of resources? Um, if you sort of lure people into, um, yeah, moving into these kinds of neighborhoods, because I mean, if you look at look at this green grass, it looks really attractive. I want to live there, right?
Mhm.
But it's very misleading, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah. I was actually wondering more about the are these like green grass properties tend to be more wealthy or
Yeah, well, it definitely. I mean, it takes money
yeah.
to build up these sprinkler systems, and also the houses are relatively big, right? Um, but I mean, so I guess they must attract like middle class, upper middle class people,
Mhm.
and yeah, I mean, yeah, it seems to not be the best use of uh, resources, right?
I definitely
Yeah.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and so, so what is your expectation about, the next years forward with regard to water and water conservation? I mean, is there any like hopeful element about ways how we could, for instance, yeah, preserve more water or do more desalination? I mean, what are the options that we have?
Well, so I mean, this research was a very long time ago, but I think if I remember back then, we thought uh, that first of all, monitoring is very important because monitor is very uneven across the country. You know, in some places they take measurements very regularly, and other places they don't. So I think maybe start from there, get an accurate sense of the water table. And in that particular study, we didn't consider aquifer storativity. So that's something that also impacts. So I guess the relationship isn't as simple, but it's also true that it's disturbing that most I think there were overall more declines than there are increases. Um, so yeah, so definitely something has to be done to reverse the trend.
Right. I mean, I mean, one of the ways how to go about it, I think, so in Saudi Arabia, I know that they have these desalinization plants, and it sounds very promising, except that those desalination plants are very energy intensive, correct?
I
So
would imagine so. Yeah.
right, so you're basically having to burn fossil fuels, which a country like Saudi Arabia has an abundance of.
Mhm.
And I guess like the latest thing I heard that they try to switch to solar panels, which because it's also like a very sunny region.
Mhm.
But yeah, so the thing that we sort of praise as a solution potentially to water shortages, um, you know, actually could create other problems, right? And I know in China also, like they have this water transfer project, right, where it's about, because like in the south it rains a lot, and then the north is a drier area, so they have this canal system that connects the south with the north of the country.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, but it seems to be like it's a very expensive piece of infrastructure to want to build this thing up, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know whether you know other countries could do something similar. Like I mean, like in the U.S., we know that it's like the West-East divide, right? So the West is dry and then the East is like wet.
Right.
Um, uh, like do you think it makes sense to do like a big water transfer project?
I don't know if there's the money for it.
The willingness, right? People would have to want to do that, right?
Right.
Okay, so then you did your PhD at Cornell, um, and you have studied the m- rural migrants in China, and they're moving into the big cities, and then the issue is, whether they send the kids to school, so they would be sent to low fee private schools. Um, and I must assume that all of that has to do with the hukou residency system, right? Where,
Yeah.
like, so if you're like a rural migrant moving into the city, um, your children wouldn't be entitled to attend the local public schools, correct?
Not automatically. It's like but if the schools have spots, then they can enroll. But it's kind of like they're not guaranteed it.
Yeah. So and yeah, so could you say a little bit about, yeah, I mean, how did you get into this particular project, and Yeah, what made you interested in it?
Well, I went into the program wanting to just look at anti-poverty in general, but then also just how like these policies at different levels. I know that's a very broad topic, but like how development policies actually affect people's lives. And so it kind of started from there. Then I was working with one of my advisors. You might know him, Eli Friedman,
Oh yes.
who was interested in this issue. So it's because he's looking at how like the let's see how it was put, how like the migrant workers are integrated in terms of their labor, or in the economic sphere, but there's in the social sphere they are excluded, and so there's that kind of disconnect there. And so I guess that's kind of how I got into it. Because he was interested in like the the schooling part, because that's the reproduction of labor part. And um and I was also just interested in like some of the social aspects of urbanization, because I feel like those aren't talked about as much.
Right. So basically, an important reason of the rural to urban migration is integration into the labor market. But I think also like in the paper you so this is like the you could say the pull factor. I mean, what attracts people to go into the city. Um, but also I think you mentioned in the paper like the push factors as well, right? So there's reasons why you know you can no longer as easily basically grow food and make a living off of that, right? So what are the forces that basically is uh, you're pushing the rural population out of their homes?
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of projects uh, reviving, or sort of or fighting against the poverty, like in rural areas, and some villages have become gotten better off. And but those are just the kind of like the lucky ones, I guess. And in some places people get resettled, but in the place where I did my field work, like it was a very, very poor place. So and there's really not a whole lot going on in the countryside, especially the remote parts. And they've also, like, most migrants I encountered there have been around in the city, for like on average like 10 years or something. So came here when they were teenagers, and then um, their kids may have been very young. And the reason why I thought the topic was interesting is that the role of the hukou system has sort of changed in the last few years, like in the sense that it kind of matters in some places, but it doesn't matter as much, kind of depending on what you're looking at and where you're looking at it. And so I just thought it's interesting to re-examine that and see how hukou limits some people but not others. And so
So I
yeah.
guess you refer to the difference between the first tier cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and perhaps the remaining perhaps second or third tier cities where there's perhaps less regulation, less stringent differentiation between people from the rural areas and those that are urban residents. Correct?
In some respects, but lower tier cities also might be poorer, so that they cannot, they cannot loosen the hukou restrictions. So I think it's still like, first of all, it's kind of like the rules are very different in different places, because like places like cities set their own rules more or less regarding um, hukou regulations, and sort of like what you can access, what you cannot access. what kind of people can access what kind of things. So that's what I thought was very interesting. And in the city, in that really poor province, where I interview all the parents, that's certainly like it wasn't any easier to get a hukou there than it was in the big city, but it's a slightly cheaper place to live, and um, some people can, if they're able to afford a house or something, an apartment or something, to buy one, then they have an easier time getting a hukou.
Yeah, I mean, there was this book that I was reading, Daniel Mattingly, I think, from Yale, and like he gave examples of uh, ways of doing land confiscation, right? Basically taking away the land from uh, you know farmers,
Right.
and then there's like ways how to resist it. Perhaps I think the most radical example was in Wuhan. Um, but but overall, and he argues mainly that local village associations, that are influenced by the CCP, by the Communist Party government, um, would basically ensure that that the land expropriation happens as smooth as possible, right? With little violence and things like that. Um, so yeah, so it seems to be that this kind of you know um, context also matters, right? With respect to like pushing people out from the home villages, right?
Yeah, that's definitely something that came up a lot during the interviews, is that they say their land, part of their land has been reclaimed, so they don't really have as much land to farm on anymore, so they have to move to the city.
Yeah, and then also what's very interesting is that the generational shift, right? So is it the case that perhaps people about our age or maybe slightly younger than us, maybe never had any experience doing any farm work, and therefore, um, you could say urban aspirations, which would be like going to college, graduating high school, and trying to crack into some academic job, or even like working in a factory, right? I mean, like a less skilled work. Um, those seem to be the major aspirations among young people rather than farming, right?
Probably, but I didn't encounter that segment of people, because I started out by looking for migrant schools, and the parents, like, who send their kids there are usually not those types. They're, well, I mean, not much older than us, but they also just went to school for very little. Um, their overall educational attainment is quite low, even for factory work. So, and I think they definitely have farming experience. A lot of them came to the city when they're like in early 20s or late teens. So, I mean, their kids definitely don't have any much connection with the countryside, which is like why I think this is such, so problematic. It's these kids who grew up in the city, but
Right. I mean, and the main worry, I mean, so if you were sort of the first generation migrant, right? So, you sort of have experience of both sides. So you have farming experience, then you have labor experience in the factory or something like that. Um, and um, and I must assume like that first generation of the migrant would be very flexible to some extent. Like whatever is given to me, I sort of work with that. Um, I would think that like once you're in the second generation, what's going to happen with them? Because like I mean, how flexible is the hugo system here, especially if we go into the second and the third generation. I mean, there should be ways in which integration would happen, right? I mean, or I mean, or is it like a permanent threat that um well, okay, I guess I have to go back home to my ancestral village.
I think there's not that much barrier to staying. It's the barriers are mainly for accessing these city services, whether it's certain types of employment or it's employment-based insurance, especially, and access to healthcare and education. I think those are the main barriers. There may be more, but those are the ones I looked into. And so, it's if you can manage to stay in the city without all that, then that's totally fine. It's not as if the government there is going to suddenly demolish, all the informal housing like Beijing did,
In
sort of.
Beijing, they did that. I thought about that. Yeah. Um, yeah, but in a sense, I guess like the precarity is sort of built in, and it could basically happen over multiple generations. I mean, that's a possibility, right?
Yeah, it seems like the only way to move up the sort of the ladder is to just be able to get a job and earn more money.
And then
And
there, and then you don't need the social benefits.
kind of.
I see. Okay. Now, low fee private schools, so they fulfill like a certain niche, I must assume, in the education sphere, right? Because like if your kid is not allowed to go to the public school, I would have to get into the low fee private school. Um, and then I think you also describe like the conditions under which those low fee schools are working in, which is that sometimes programs would have to be cut, because there's not enough money. Yeah, can you say a little bit more about um, yeah, how these private schools are being run, and how what's the organization is, what the challenges are.
I think it's really just depends on the person who runs it, on the principal, to set the standards and to maintain the funding. So it's so in this one school we see like the principals like sort of adding to the curriculum what she believes to be important, which is like the traditional education, like kind of reciting these like old texts. She thinks that that's being important to the kids' education. But it really just it just depends on whether that person running the school is responsible enough and rigorous enough and can secure the funds for it, because um, when you're asking poor families to pay tuition and the school is kind of run on that, that's not a um, not a super stable source of funding. And a couple principals said that they take money out of their own pocket to try to keep the school open. And so and there's just so many things that you can't really control when you're operating a school with such low resources. You can't guarantee that the teachers want to stay here, um, uh, or that the people you hire are always up to standard. And so it's just there's just a lot of problems.
So basically, so there's no regulation on the side of the government, right? So on these private schools, right?
Not beyond sort of just like maybe a visit every semester.
Right. So they would send their own official, and then they would make some inquiries about what about the baseline numbers, like how much money are you raising, how many kids are in the school, and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had found out more about what these inspections actually entail, but I think I didn't ask that question. I didn't push it.
Right, because you also say that like there's no centralized curriculum, right? I mean, like there's no benchmarks that the state sets up and says, hey, the kids have to know, I don't know, geometry to this level, and they have to write characters at this proficiency, and so on and so forth.
I mean, you do have to. I don't think migrant schools have to follow the official curriculum to be certified. Um, but I think I mean the ones I visited they do because why not, right? What else are you gonna follow? So they do use the standard textbooks and everything, but it's like I was in the classroom, like just like sort of observing how the teacher teaches and how the students learn, and it was just pandemonium because it's um a lot of students weren't really getting it, and the classroom is so like noisy and chaotic. Like the teacher cannot get through a whole lot in the class, and I could tell the students weren't really learning as much as they should, even though they're in the classroom. And also, like I observed an English class, which and the teacher was teaching something that's way too advanced for students. Like they need to take at least many steps back to make sure everyone's on the same page. But it's like,
Yeah. So, and be- because I guess the challenge here is that these are not kids of the upper middle class, right? I mean, like there wouldn't be this. So I mean, I know some friends and colleagues, one in Taiwan and the other now teachers in Shanghai, but they're studying the kids of the upper middle class and basically how they get into the cram schools and take GRE lessons, and like it's really very much drilled to basically maximize the chances for the children to get into well, either to the top universities in China, like Beida, Tsinghua, or to the foreign universities, in the Western countries. And but yeah, I mean, but the people that you were studying here, I mean, it's sort of like at the upper other end of the socioeconomic ladder. I mean, these are like kids where the parents are working, I guess, like manual laboring jobs,
yeah,
and then so I guess the expectation upon the children would be that do your best in school, but if you don't make it, you'll just have to work a job like we do, basically, right?
yeah.
um and I mean, like is there any like aspiration like from the parents of those students, like about you know educational outcomes that they want to see?
Yeah, I think most people I spoke with do. Um, but they would just say like something like hope the kid will finish as many years as possible. Like they know not to expect like, oh, my kid has to go to college. No, not like that. But it's like, but they hope their kid can stay in school for as long as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's the situation in these schools. And like, do you know what happens to a lot of these kids or students? I mean, so does it go up to a certain grade level, those private schools?
Yeah. So some go up to 9 years. I think that's the highest one, and some are 6 years, and some has a preschool component, some don't. Um, oh, and back to the aspiration thing, like I actually surveyed a bunch of third graders and asked them if they think that their parents care about their education, and the vast majority of them like said yes, that like they believe that their parents care about the schooling. So that was encouraging to hear. And yeah, I think like, and also these schools sometimes they're like there's this one school that was forced to like move because of uh the government needs to redevelop the land, and so I think he had to eliminate maybe certain grades, because if there's no teacher to teach it, or if there's no money to hire a teacher, like that grade or that class will have to go. Like it's not, it's, so everything is really just subject to change.
Yeah. And do you know anything about, yeah, what happens to these kids? So they do they join like the labor force right away? I mean, or um, do some of them actually have a chance to transfer perhaps to another high school, or get into university?
Yeah, so the ages of the kids in elementary schools, migrant schools, are, like the age range is much wider, because like some kids never went to school, or some kids keep repeating grades, and so by the time they come out of elementary school, they could be like 14 or 15, if not older. And so in some cases they would just start working right away. And but the one of the schools has, like, there's a migrant high school right next to it, so a lot of kids just go to that secondary school. um, and I think a very very small percent of kids might have a chance at public schools. It kind of depends on where they are in the city. If it's like not there's not that much demand from local kids for that school, then maybe the public school has some spaces. And then in which case, but the problem is, usually when they join public school, they're not like, very much behind their urban counterparts, because urban kids would have learned not just what they were taught, but also like a lot from extra classes and like tutoring, and they just have like such a huge advantage over the migrant kids, even if they are in the same school. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and if you analyze it from the perspective of the teachers, I mean, so as you mentioned, like, you know how the teacher was teaching in a manner that was too difficult, too advanced for the students to comprehend. Like, where do those teachers come from? I mean, what's the sort of social background? I mean, are they university graduates who uh sort of failed to, I don't know, get a job in a regular public school, and they're like, okay, well, I want to continue teaching, so I'll take any job that's available, including in these low fee private schools. Um, yeah, what can you say about the background of the teachers?
Yeah, there are definitely those people, and there are also teachers that retired from teaching in public schools.
And they, I guess, and then at that point they would be driven by like a social mission, right?
Yeah, and they're less concerned with the low pay, and because it's kind of just like, and it's, but they want to keep teaching. And so yeah, so I met those, and I also met the young like college grads who but yeah, it's just like when they're because they're teaching from the textbook, and if this is a grade six textbook, I'm gonna like, they're just gonna teach from the grade six textbook, but the students actually aren't there yet, like, um, because they've fallen behind due to a lot of reasons, and but the teacher still just keeps carrying on.
Yeah, yeah, right. Because also, like, to some extent, the teacher maybe is used to, like, instructing students who uh who basically went through like a controlled curriculum, right? So it's like, oh, in first grade, you have to learn this kind of arithmetic, and then second grade it's a little more complex, and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
And but what you're saying is that, well, in these private schools there's a big age range, so basically you could have students who were instructed a little bit too late, so it may be more difficult. So they have a bunch of material that they perhaps didn't learn to begin with. And so, but I mean, from a teacher perspective, I mean, there's no way how you can balance it out, right? Because you're going to have 30 students with different skill levels.
Yeah,
So,
that's
yeah.
the challenge. It's the migrant school class sizes are actually smaller than the public school class sizes, but I mean still big compared to the U.S. standards. But it's just like it's difficult for the teacher to make sure everybody is caught up. Um, and you know, and in the so it's yeah, so you're the skill gap is or not skill gap, it's like the range of like what the student already knows or is able to learn like varies a lot. And the problem is like these kids are disadvantaged and they actually need extra help, so it's like so they need more sort of individualized one-on-one attention that the schools aren't always able to provide. I mean, sometimes they have volunteers or nonprofit organizations working with them to offer these things, but often they don't. And but these students need that. And then when you have a classroom where like some students want to learn, some students don't want to learn as much, and these kids are actually causing so much like ruckus that I feel like the students who want to learn are also kind of being hampered a little bit in that environment.
Yeah. So it's a big challenge to, basically make the situation better for the students. I don't recall whether in the paper you raised whether there was some, policy solution. I mean, like, is there a way, you know, like, I mean, even if you can not completely get rid of the hukou system, because, of course, the city residents, they want to, keep the resources for themselves. I mean, absent of that, abolishing the hukou system, like, is there like a second best way of how to deal with, like, migrant kids education?
Other than allocating more money into the whole education system, not really. So it's really just about distributing the funds a little, like putting more money into into schools, build more schools, because right now the in that city, even in public schools, the class sizes are like staggering already. And so I can see the capacity issue, but it's really just about taking money from elsewhere and putting it into schools. Like it's just about spending priorities. And I mean, you can have solutions, but all of these things just cost money. You can have solutions such as, you know, building schools near, especially near sort of migrant neighborhoods, or expanding schools near migrant neighborhoods, um, like, or just have like more regulation over, maybe not have the school to be entirely public and still have some individual run it, but with more funding and regulation oversight. That could be the next best thing, I suppose. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but you've seen the statistic recently. I think the demographic data from China, which said that there were 12 million births, which last year, which is quite a disappointment for the, officials. Um, and now and after that, census was published, they then shifted from the two-child to the three-child policy, um, which I guess they're going to roll out in next year or something. Um, and yeah, so I guess the relationship to that schooling argument is that, you know shouldn't the demand for school spots diminish as a result of the demographic decline? Um, well, I guess it really depends, right? Because maybe in the big cities, you'll always have people who want to come in, right? So the pressure is huge there. But but shouldn't this sort of like demographic trend imply that, you know that actually, well, there should be school closures, right? You don't actually need that many schools.
Yeah, well,
Mm.
hopefully that'll be like that'll lessen the pressure a little bit, but I don't think it's enough to counter like the whole moving into city thing. In rural areas, a lot of schools have been closed or combined into one and consolidated, and so that's happening. But like in the city, I think there's still just too many people coming in, and the I don't know about the decline birth rate. Maybe that'll have an effect in a few years. But so far it doesn't seem to be a problem that's going away anytime soon.
Yeah, we'll have to observe that trend here. So then you have another project where also based in China, and you look at the relationship between housing purchases among rural migrants in cities, and it varies by the enrollment in social insurance, and also being able to keep the family unit together. Um, yeah. So yeah, how did you get to that project, and what's the implication of that finding?
So there are these people at I can't remember which university, but they conducted these surveys in 2011, 13, and 15. Um, Massive nationwide surveys. They took samples from all of the provinces, and and recorded like 300 or 400 or something like that crazy high number of indicators of household finance. So things like debt, um, definitely income, and a lot of like a lot of like not indicator having to do with owning house and how many bedrooms in the house, or like uh, well, things like that. Just kind of everything you can think of that that falls under household finance. I feel like that data set has it. So really just this project just kind of takes the social security aspect, and basically the variables I chose are just kind of based on readings of what's in sort of what researchers have found to be important in migrants deciding to settle down in the city. So I can't remember all everything that I've chosen, but I do remember the significant ones. It's like the access to medical insurance, which actually kind of makes sense if you think about it. Uh, because I also the split family thing. I wanted to look at children, but I think there was some problem with the data that made me decide not to use that one. But previous studies have shown that kind of like kids actually definitely help, because if they get attached to the city, the parents are more persuaded to stay there. So and and a lot of time, like being able to access insurance or buy insurance for your kids, depending on you having insurance yourself. Um, so those are the two factors that turned out to be important.
Right, and so I guess the suggestion would be that you know if you want the migrant laborers to stick around in the city, um, you would have to grant them with social insurance, and that's very interesting because, as we said earlier, with the hukou, I mean, it would limit your access to certain social benefits, social entitlements, including the schooling and healthcare. But then I think empirically you find that there are cases where these migrant workers would be able to become part of the social insurance, like health and pensions. And yeah,
So they
yeah,
get
how
a
does it happen?
job. That's basically usually how it happens. If they get a job that offers those benefits, or if they're wealthy enough to buy private insurance, um, third-party insurance, and some migrant kids do get into public schools. So that's why it's just not a guarantee. Um, yeah.
Right. So there's ways how to acquire social services, social insurance, but it would be through private means. So it wouldn't be guaranteed through the state. And
Right, right.
yeah, so I guess that, from the policymaker's standpoint, I mean, does it mean that, okay, well, the market has already figured it out, and so why would we have to do anything about it? But I mean, but you still make the case that the state um, should perhaps do more to uh, provide for social welfare, right?
Oh yeah, because I remember reading some studies that show that income is actually not that important a factor in drawing like migrants. So if you know, maybe to an extent, I don't think it entirely does matter. But I think just like normal income gap between like the average sort of job that migrant gets between like a big city and small city, like that's too small to actually make too much of a difference. If you get a higher paying job in a city that doesn't let your kids go into public schools, you might choose a different city then. So um so if a city wants to retain more migrants, then you need to make sure that they have sort of everything that they need out besides just work. um and um and if they stay, they can, there's more chance of them, spending and consuming, and good for the economy in the long run. So yeah, that's what I think they should do.
Right. Because see, if you have like state provision of social insurance, pension, health, and things like that, and also schooling, education, childcare, it would be more like, yeah, some of the European welfare systems. And because one of the things that I've learned about the sort of the Chinese transition into modern market economy, is that social services are being pushed into the private hands, and people have to sort of, like, for instance, if you want to get like a heart surgery, which you absolutely need, and um you could pay money extra, and then you would get access to that medical care. um and and then maybe the last 10 years, 10, 15 years or so, I think there's been a slight shift now more onto the like paternalistic social welfare state. um like, how do you evaluate like the overall trend? I mean, is it more towards the sort of paternalistic welfare state that we know from the European countries? I mean, um or actually, I think that the US model of sort of like a hybrid, markets and state provision, that's sort of the balance in which the Chinese welfare state is moving towards, right?
Yes, yeah, it is definitely more hybrid, but the state provision, like I feel, is definitely still lacking. I mean, like the number of people who have hukou, of course, it's like are is right. That number is rising, and but I don't know if that's simply from like this, the city expanding, and the people sort of on the fringe being incorporated, or it's um but some city do have like a number of slots, like number of like hukou that they can give out to people, kind of like uh I think the rules are different for different city. Like they might require the like ask certain things of like of migrants, that they have to meet certain criteria to qualify. But
Is it length of residence? Is it asset availability?
I think it
Uh,
depends on the length of residence, but maybe also just like education level. And
Education. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
So So I don't know, to be honest. Sometimes it feels like more things are being becoming, privatized and like left to the market. And in fact, a lot of migrants don't even when they can get a hukou, they don't, because why? Because why would they, right? Because they have kind of have, if they're wealthy enough, they have kind of have the best of both worlds, because having a rural hukou comes with its own benefits. And if they don't need the city's benefits as much, they even choose not to get it, because it would mean they'll have to give up their rural hukou, which they probably don't want to.
So because the rural hukou is about access to land, I must assume.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, right. So if you in a sense, I mean, if you have a, let's say if you're a small business owner in and you sell, I don't know, goods in a city, and then at the same time you have part of your family, let's say, you know, your aging parents or something like that, that live in the countryside and they maintain like the farming lifestyle, you know. So in that sense, I mean, you basically have, yeah, you have one foot in on each side, and it might actually be better to keep the, the rural hukou, right?
Yeah, and I also feel this like hukou awarding system is a little bit backwards. I mean, they're trying to award people who, they consider to be assets to the city, but a lot of times those aren't the people who need help the most. It's, it's the people I spoke to in the city where I did the study on migrant schools. Their rural hukou isn't worth anything, because there's nothing there. So they're the ones who can really, who can really use benefit from being incorporated into the city and make that transition sort of permanent. I feel people who have the option to keep their rural hukou and to choose not to get urban hukou are people who have more options. Um, and I mean, yeah.
Right. I mean, but it's not entirely surprising. I mean, if you look at the entire like migration literature, right? Not just in China, but really globally, specifically in the Western countries. You know, if you like, you have like on the one extreme, you have like countries like Canada and Australia, right? Where you know because you know they basically they don't really have land borders. Well, Canada has it with the U.S., but the U.S. is another rich country, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so they're hyper selective with respect to migration. And so they give out a point system, right, where they say, oh, well, you know, if you went to university, if you speak English well, you know, like there's a bunch of things that you fulfill, and then you get a green card based on that. Um, and then as a result of it, you know, it's very interesting that in just in those two countries, like immigration is not very controversial as a topic. You know, like it doesn't really rile up, you could say, right wing conservative parties, um, because because the migrants population tends to be better educated, higher income, less likely to commit crime. You know, all these things that people would sort of negatively associate with migration. Um, and while in the European countries, um, there isn't that much of like conscious choice, you could say, about migration, because basically Europe is neighboring countries, where you have civil war, you have problems, social political instability, like Middle East, Africa, and and over there, I mean, migration is extremely controversial, right? There's like this whole notion of like, oh no, no, we gotta keep our country pure, of the sort of migrant stock, especially like in Eastern European countries. It's a very strong notion. Um, And yeah, because the issue is like, can you control the flow of the population into your country, into your jurisdiction? Um, and and if you can really only choose, like if you can only cherry pick, you only pick the ones that you want for your country, I think that reduces the controversial nature of migrant labor.
Mhm.
And and it seems to me that's what the Chinese cities are doing as well, right? It's
Right, but um, I'm okay. I'm thinking what. So we're talking about permanent migration here, but so Chinese cities, of course, they cannot close their borders. So they can't stop people from coming in. It's just a matter of withholding uh services or public goods. Maybe like either in hope of reserving these for the people that they want, or I hope not, but I really hope that Chinese cities aren't withholding services in order to drive out the migrants they don't want, because that would be just very awful. And yeah, so even with countries, especially democratic countries, like we can't really stop migration flows. If people can manage to get in, they can manage to stay. And um, the I think the controversy is that the people who are anti-migration they do not acknowledge the value of the work that these migrants do, um, and that they are important assets because they do the jobs that you don't want. And but those work sometimes just doesn't have proper value tied to it, I feel.
I mean, like this whole idea of like exploitation, it works precisely because the status is liminal, right? Uncertain. So I mean, if you think about in the US, here we had these struggles by Uber drivers to become employees rather than contractors. Um, and so that legal distinction is very important because the contractors wouldn't be provided with social benefits, like pension plans and insurance, health insurance, etc. Um, and
The thing is,
yeah,
I don't know all the citizenship rules in different countries, but I think in Canada, if you live there consecutively for 3 months, then you get the healthcare. I think it's something like that. So it's in that sense, it's not like you absolutely have to have citizenship um, to um, to get something this basic.
yeah, and I know of cases. I think in one documentary, like there were like Americans that lived in the border town to Canada, and they actually got a residence card in Canada, just so that they can, you know, visit a doctor, because presumably the insurance is not affordable in the U.S., right? Um, yeah. Okay. So I think that's a discussion about China. I mean, unless you have some other points that you want to raise there, because you also have a lot of research experience about the U.S. and uh, so you have this paper about um, tax expenditure limits, um, and so I guess the idea is that uh, s- states have the entitlement to restrict revenue raising options for municipalities and counties.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, and so I guess the idea is that if you make these limits too tight, then yeah, I guess what would happen is maybe debt would go up, perhaps, or they have to find uh, other ways how to raise money to pay for services. Um, and the difficult thing is also that the state is mandating um, service provision at the county and municipal level, right?
Mhm.
um, and that puts these counties and municipalities in the bind. So yeah, talk a little bit about how you got into this topic and yeah, what the major challenges are that exist between state and counties.
Okay, yeah. So this came out of a class project, a class on devolution, privatization, and sort of new management. And it was like we had like 6 different groups, and I was assigned into this group because nobody volunteered for this group because tax policy is like less alluring than a lot of the other topics in economic development. So I was put in this group with several other people, and then we sort of divvied up the work with some of them. Uh, I think 2 people were looking at how tax caps restrict New York uh, localities over like a long period of time because it kind of accumulates. And me and this other guy, we were looking at other states, especially like the taxpayer bill of rights in Colorado, the PTELs, this stand for property tax something limitation probably, in Illinois, and the proposition, God, was the famous 13 from California. Um, that was the first one, I think. Um, and there was the proposition 2.5. Okay, I would have to look back onto at the issue brief. I'm not sure if I remember all of these names correctly, but we're looking at all these cases from various states, and somehow like the I think that the professor uh, just asked me to sort of keep working on it and sort of build out this like database of statutes of all the property, not property, just tax caps in general for on counties, municipality, and school district. Because a lot of times it's the same for counties and municipalities, but it's different for a school district. So we separate out all of these different types of governments, and we just grab all the statutes using 3 major sources, and yeah, it's just kind of like it was a lot of work building that database, and then we decided to take the break down the statutes and grade them essentially, and so to develop a numerical measure for how strict the this thing is. And so Colorado's Tabor taxpayer bill of rights is very restrictive. It limits a lot of things by a lot. So in the end, Colorado ranked number 1 of all the states based on our measure.
So what would be a measure for limitation? I mean, does it say counties are not allowed to raise property taxes at all?
Yeah, so it depends on what the limit actually applies to, whether it's like applies to a tax rate, in which case we'll grade based on the millage um, of that limit sets. If it's on the property, the tax levy or the ceiling, for example, like maybe it says that it cannot grow by more than faster than the inflation or something like that, or 2%, like the maximum increase is 2%, and then so we will grade it based on like exactly what the specification is. And similar for sort of limits on assessment increases, like the property value cannot, the taxable value cannot rise by a certain um, level or percentage points. Anyways, so it's just things like that. And we also take into consideration the type of things that are excluded from these limits. So like usually some type of critical services like fire, um, the fire department or something like that, special districts sometimes exempt from this exclusion. And also we consider that, and we consider how hard it is to override these limits. So if it takes like a super majority of the taxpayers, then that's pretty hard to override. It's pretty hard to pass. But if it's just like a majority of like the people who are elected officials, then that's relatively, easy. So um, yeah, so we consider all those things, and when we tabulate our numbers.
Right. I mean, and so then again, so if you are like a municipality and you have restrictions on, let's say, property tax increases, there's a possibility, however, to raise revenues in other ways. Um, I mean, sales taxes. I know some cities are relying on that, and I think you also mentioned like user fees. And like from a municipal level, if, for instance, the water and utilities is owned by municipality, they would also control utility charges, right? So they could increase that.
Right. Yeah, so we did find that municipalities that have more strict tax caps, they tend to rely more on these other type of revenue sources, but that are not generally available to counties. So, which is why counties get uh, kind of, they're the ones that are really affected by this. And I'm just kind of looking back because this was a while ago, so I'm looking at if there are any places that have like no override provisions, which would mean that you can't even override it. I can't remember if there are any places like that. Um,
So the way, I mean, so if you're like a really hard pressed county, so you have very strict tax expenditure limits, and then but then you have service provision requirements that you have to fulfill, right? So like what's the way practically to fill that gap? I mean, I guess it would vary, but like give us a picture of that.
well, like for some of the poorer counties, like um, they are very unlikely to pass overrides, because that would require like a
It would be
sort
about
of
overriding the expenditure limits, right?
limits. Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's because people are less would be less able to, like, or less willing to vote on the raise in taxes, and they would just accept like whatever the level of service is dropping. And so that's why we also argue that this tax cap, you kind of, because almost every, usually every county and municipality is under the same rule from the state. So but the local conditions are very, very different. So we're saying maybe it's, you shouldn't apply the same restriction to every locality. I think it's just only in some states there are certain exceptions, but mostly it's like the rule applies to every county or every municipality or every school district, the same set of rules.
Yeah, and also like the size of the state aid also matters a lot, right? And I guess that also varies by state because in some states you might get um you know more money allocated from the state, and then in others you get less. So I would assume that it would be in states and counties where there's very little state aid, there's very high service provision requirements, um, and there's very strict expenditure limits. That would be sort of like the most hard pressed. I mean, it would
Yeah.
be the biggest contradiction, so to speak. And yeah, and it might make it very unattractive to become a local official, right? Because I mean, you sort of have this idea, okay, I like to serve my community. I run for mayor or from city council or some county official office, but you know, uh, to have those kinds of onerous and contradictory requirements would make it very unappealing. But I mean, like did you calculate like um the percentage of counties that find themselves in a hard pressed situation? I mean, are there many of those? I mean, or it's just a handful that we have to pay attention to?
Well, we didn't do that because that would require collecting data on all the counties. And we the study didn't go that far. Um, but since like this restrictiveness is by state, so it's considered like a state level thing, which means that all counties in the state would face the same type of limit. And I guess to find out where are the places that are struggling most, we'll just have to like overlay that with um, county or locality wealth and also the state equalization thing. But yeah, but the thing is like states also put tax cuts on themselves, which is not the what we looked at in this paper, but states also restrict their own tax collection and also expenditures. So um, and it's all part of this like trying to limit the government size and not have it or that's the argument about it.
Right, and then s- so and also like you hear about like balanced budget amendments uh and the idea is that, well, if you're a state, you're not able to print your money, and I mean, if you look, for instance, at a big chunk of the COVID stimulus money that was passed in Congress um, was what's called direct aid to state and local governments. And I guess the idea was that, you know, making sure that the state and local governments are not laying off, teachers and cops and so forth. Um, but I guess the idea is always that, it's only the federal state, the federal government, which operates without, like a hard budget constraint, right? So, but if you're like a state official, you're like, wow, okay, if I'm gonna cut these taxes, okay, then I'm gonna eventually cut this kind of spending, right? I mean, so there's less leeway, I think, um, in in like basically matching revenue versus spending, right?
Yeah. I'm not super knowledgeable about federal policy and or federal state relationship. Yes. So I can't really speak on about that, but yeah, I think what you said sound right.
Yeah. So, so then the last major area would be tax abatement. So I really enjoyed your work on Amazon warehouse locations,
Oh, thank you.
and yeah, it's great graphic depiction. And so we know that this, Amazon is basically at this point, I think, the second biggest private sector employer. I mean, there's like over 1 million employees, I think,
Sorry,
globally.
after what?
I think it was Walmart, right? Walmart is still bigger, I'd say.
Walmart's still the biggest. Okay.
I think so. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, maybe this could have changed by now. But Amazon is very, very influential because b- I mean, so there's this idea about customer convenience, right? And I think that you know Amazon like perfectly fills out that niche, right? That convenience of you know being able to purchase whatever you want by a mouse click, so you don't have to leave your house, right? But
Yeah, especially during the pandemic, like that's definitely I think a lot of people had to kind of rely on Amazon almost.
right, and and so then the issue becomes that Well, so first of all, on the labor relations front, I mean, so I've got this one project that was part of the station, um, where the warehouse work is strictly monitored, right? I mean, there's like very clear output targets for each individual employee because it's tracked, right? How many items are getting processed,
Mhm.
and so to that extent, I mean, totally changes the retail experience. I mean, not just on the customer end, but even on the labor end, right? Um, because I mean, I used to work for a shoe store, and of course, there were a lot of like mundane tasks that you would have to do, right? You have to stock shelves, which is not very glamorous, but there was one positive element, which is sometimes you have customers that walk in that you would speak to, that you would interact with, and they taught you something about the world, like, or they had a good conversation. And um but it's like, okay, well, with Amazon you sort of cut that piece out, because you're not talking with your delivery driver who delivers your packages, because he doesn't have any time, right? I mean, he has to
Yeah,
deliver the packages as fast as possible along a coordinated route. You're also not talking to the warehouse workers, who of course are, it's like, it's almost like when you buy a car, right? Like car manufacturing, like you're not talking with the car manufacturing worker, right?
yeah.
um
Many degrees of separation. Oh, did you see this piece in New York Times? I think it was about it's like when workers need something, like if they're sick or something, and then they couldn't get through to their manager, because like when they try to call, it's just those automatic, or oh my god, what do you call those, like when you call and it's just like a preset menu, and then you keep trying to click on, or and then you could never talk to like like you never get to talk to an actual person. And
yeah, it's like almost like a robot, basically, that yeah.
yeah, and then this worker was like sick with COVID, and he couldn't, and then somehow he just got fired or something like that, because like they forgot, like he just got lost in the system, like they probably messed him up with someone else, and thought he wasn't coming to work anymore or something, and then when we tried to call, he couldn't reach an actual person. Um,
Yeah, I have one of my colleagues, I mean, she does much more qualitative work than me. Uh f- like a study about like the delivery drivers, so the guys that deliver the Amazon packages. And the basic challenge is that the middle management function becomes automated, right?
I,
And so because there's just this algorithm, and you basically communicate with that algorithm on your phone. And the problem is that, okay, well, so you try to reach the HR department, but it's very difficult to do that. And because it's in human interaction, I mean, like, you can sort of explain your situation in like a few sentences, whatever. It's like, could be, I have a flat tire or something like that, right? uh and so therefore, I'm going to be late with my delivery. um and if you have a human manager, I think he would take note of that and cut some slack. But you can't really communicate that to an algorithm. So
yeah,
yeah, so then what happens is that the drivers would have to spend time trying to find a human manager. Well, that takes time, and that of course is deducted from their permissible taking time off. um and so the glitches in the algorithm suggest that you know it just makes it more difficult for the workers to sort of manage the situation, right?
yeah,
Now, of course, the flip side is like, if you might not have like as much like emotional management issues. Like, I mean, imagine In any workplace you have like a toxic supervisor, um,
That is true. Yeah.
so you don't face that on the flip side of it. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, so but in a sense, yeah, so algorithmic management, I think that's sort of the big finding. I mean, across like the entire yeah literature about gig economy, of which the Amazon is part of.
Yeah.
And
It's fascinating. I mean, it's unfortunate for the people who are negatively affected by this, but but this thing is like this whole thing is fascinating and bewildering. I guess might be a more suitable word of how much this has been like automated.
yeah, yeah, well, so that would be the big argument that I would raise, which is that automation is, so it's not just with the middle management that what they're trying to do, um, but also the entire process of delivery, right? So
Yeah.
and so you could be self-driving cars would be one element of that. Drone delivery would be another element.
Mm.
And then inside the warehouse, basically, so one thing they already automated was like shelf moving, moving of items, that reduced the walking time among the warehouse workers. Um, and then the next step, really, and this is really the, you could say, $1 million question for Amazon, is training robotic arms, right? Robotic arms with object recognition,
Mm.
because at that moment when they're able to recognize objects, grabbing, packaging, um, like once that portion becomes automated, then a big chunk of the warehouse work, which is picking, is going to be automated. Um, Now, I mean, of course, like you can be like a technology pessimist, and you could say, well, okay, they're still like 10 years, 20 years away from that. And they could be. I mean, it could be the same as the self-driving cars, which people have said, "Oh, it's going to happen this year. It's going to happen this year," and then it didn't happen. But I I don't know. I mean, like my view of looking at it is very dynamic. It's like, you know, like does it really matter whether it's like 10 years or 20 years or 5 years? I mean, if it's eventually going to happen, right? So, um,
Well, I suppose with if it's 20 years, then there's some time for governments to implement training programs and get more workers, to do something else.
yeah, I mean that's very much what the hope is. But yeah, I guess my issue is about, so I was recently reading this book by Daniel Zuskind, and he's sort of like one of these automation experts. And he basically is an automation enthusiast, and he says that robots and AI, they don't have to be like a human, which is, it's a very high threshold to clear, because what we have on our side is not just object recognition, but it's also like abstract concepts and creativity, managerial skills, etc. But it just has to be better or as good as a human in certain tasks. So as long as you can break down an occupation into its component tasks, um, you you could eliminate, or at the very least you could reduce the labor, right? So I spoke with one of the with a radiology um, engineer, so not a radiologist, but the guy who develops the radiology products, and he says that one implication for doing radiology automation is not about replacing the radiologist, but rather to reduce the number of radiologists that the society needs. Because let's say instead of having, you know, I don't know, every radiologist like looking at the, the mammogram,
Mhm.
and sort of interpreting and then doing the diagnosis, you basically let AI do the diagnosis, and the radiologist just confirms or disconfirms. And so that means that instead of, let's say, analyzing, you know, one mammogram per hour, it would be, six or seven. And so that would be the efficiency gain. And then at that point, you could be like, okay, we we reduce the number of radiologists that we need. Um, and and so that's my impression of what could be done at the level of the warehouses and the delivery system. But short term, we're not seeing that, right? Short term, actually, Amazon is hiring like crazy.
Right. They
Um,
are.
yeah,
Well,
it's
I feel like automation is itself is not a bad thing. It's supposed to generate more sort of output and more value. But it's just matter of since the jobs are going to be eliminated, it's a matter of getting these people to do something else. Hopefully, better jobs that produce more value, and also the benefits from automation are distributed more evenly. So I think that's the those are the challenges.
yeah. So I mean, part of what I've been arguing for, and I think the Amazon study sort of shows that as well, is the necessity of UBI, basic income program, um, where basically the underlying premise is that you separate the link between you know work and income, um, and because I think we have a lot of political and social instability at the moment in a lot of developed countries, um, and that's because first of all, I mean, our economies aren't growing as fast as they did in the past, um, and then the secondary effect of that, well, how do we know that the economy isn't growing as much? Well, first of all, I mean, you see like a savings glut where you can see the stock markets are going up because basically rich people park their money in assets, like stocks and housing. Um, and the other way how you can tell is because there's not enough middle class jobs. I mean, the fact that, like, you and I mean, we graduate from one of the top institutes, Ivy League schools, and we're like, oh wow, okay, there's not enough academic jobs. So then, okay, then let's compete for, I don't know, a think tank or data analysis or user experience researchers. So it's another big field that graduates in my institute go to. Um, and yeah, so I think there's plenty of economic anxiety in the population because the number of middle class positions is just shrinking basically. Um, and well, total work is not, we're not losing that yet because, as we said, Amazon is hiring a lot of people. Um, so we're in this very uncomfortable position where there's a lot of low wage jobs, and that's sort of like low wage precariat. I mean, that's going to continue expanding. Um, and yeah, and I was wondering, well, what would be a way out of that? Well, I mean, either you have to accelerate the growth rate and you'd have to get businesses to hire more labor, um, do, what like Asamolo, I think he calls it like labor friendly automation, right? Um, basically the idea would be that you invest in technology only if it augments labor, right? If it increases demand for labor, right? Um, and yeah, okay, that's one way. I mean, and the other way would be that is to just harp on social policies, right? You just focus on the redistribution of income rather than the redistribution of work.
Right.
Uh, yeah, do you have a position on that issue?
Well, I mean, this type of macroeconomics thing is not my area of expertise, but I think redistribution of income plus a lot of investment education and training um, are the two things that I find to be most important.
Yeah, I mean, education training, I think that could also be a route, and that would definitely be good for universities. It would be good for training centers. Um, it would be sort of another major industry that could be supported. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, like I'm a little bit of like an education idealist, meaning for me, like universities should be reserved for people who care about university stuff. So it would be like, well, I mean, it could be anything from engineering to humanities and social sciences or STEM or whatever, right? But it would have to be a place for people who actually enjoyed it, rather than like a social obligation. If you see what I'm saying, right? Um,
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I mean, I'm thinking more like um, sort of on the job training type of thing, where I guess companies get awarded by or rewarded by governments for taking on for increasing the skill level of like its employees and sort of like I mean like the organization I work at, like we're against a lot of like corporate giveaways, but but like but we're more on the fence about like sort of reimbursements for training. And as for the education, I think with the Amazon HQ2 being located in Virginia, I think one of Amazon's side of the bargain, like they have to live up to, is to make all these investments um, at all sort of all grade levels, but also like college programs and especially in technology and computer science. So I was more thinking more along those lines, like more practical type of uh, programs. And yes, and university of course still open to people who want to actually go to university, but also just have those other vocational programs.
yeah, I mean, I think vocational programs they will matter at the margins. You know, but I don't think it fits the scale of the, you could say, major job challenges that we have going forward. I was reminded of a quote by Andrew Yang. He ran for president last year and this year for mayor in New York City. And he was saying that it's very presumptuous to sort of think that, let's say, a truck driver who gets replaced by a self-driving truck to become a computer coder, right? Because it's like a very different kind of skill. I mean, it's not impossible. I mean, of course, people who want to do it and who are motivated, I think they should do it by all means.
Mhm.
Um, uh, but I guess like he used a like very extreme example, like from basically you know um, low cognitive to high cognitive jobs. That that sort of transition is kind of illusory, right? Um,
Right. So I think like apprenticeships would be the way to go because like it um because then it sort of ensures like a like match between the skills you get and the job um or the demand for certain type of skills and so that there isn't like a mismatch and if it's like a truck driver or something like and it's up to him where he wants to work and hopefully this workplace will offer opportunities to get him trained um and so yeah so that's kind of what I see to be like the way how how investment training can achieve sort of like the maximum effectiveness is to make sure that it
mm.
matches the company.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I think training programs. I think they should be tried, and and I think it can accommodate people who lose a job because of automation. Um, I'm just worried that it doesn't fit the magnitude of the crisis, basically, of the jobs crisis that could result from AI and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, it's a so I argued in a blog post very recently that like the leisure coordinator would be the most important occupation in the 21st century, and by leisure coordinator I mean it's a very huge umbrella term to me. Like it could be anything from you know yeah, being a dog walker for your neighbors, being a yoga instructor, um, being an artist, painters, musicians, YouTube content creators, like the stuff like after we're done with the podcast, I'll put it up there. Um, it's yeah, it's ultimately it's some form of entertainment, I would say, and it oftentimes is not money generating, right? So I don't have enough views to get any advertising, for instance. So yeah, I think that's sort of the world that we would have to try to build. And of course, it's only possible if there is some kind of UBI, or if there's some kind of redistribution that already happens that allows everybody to access, you could say the scarce resources like housing and food and things like that. Um, yeah, but so in your conception, like, do you think that a human being has to feel valuable by selling his or her labor in the labor market? Is that like do you assume that as a given?
Well, I think it should be like that way. Like I ideally like um let me see how to put it. I mean, because like job and career is like one of the major areas where people derive like meaning of life and for living. Um, so it's important that people get to do what they want to do and feel appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, so my favorite example of somebody who puts in a lot of work but doesn't get paid is a guy is so he's a civil servant, works I think for in like Virginia State or something, and but the most interesting stuff is what he does after work, right? Which is so he edited one third of all the English Wikipedia articles. And if you actually go to his house, I mean, like you see like encyclopedias everywhere on the wall. I mean, he sort of picks them out, and then he probably reads books, and so he basically supplements these Wikipedia articles with facts.
Mhm.
and basically, I mean, of course, like Wikimedia Foundation. I mean, it's not completely for free because you have you do have full time editors there, but they work on donations. And also to run the server, I think that costs some money. But other than that, I mean, most of the value production of Wikipedia is yeah, is people like him
Yeah.
who don't do it for any money. And that to me it's a very interesting model, right? Where, like, is it possible to sort of, you know create use value in the economy without without charging for it? Because that would reduce the cost of living of the population. You'd still have labor, people are still working, things like that. um yeah, that would be the big challenge, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why thinking UBI would be a very good idea, because then it frees people up to do what they want to do, and instead of what they have to do.
Yeah, and I think that, I think today is a much easier way to make that case than back in the past. Because I mean, like, if you read people like Aristotle, who says that, you know only free men can do philosophy, which is to say, basically everybody else, like, so if you're like a woman or if you are a slave, um, then you're supposed to do all of the work,
You don't have
including
the luxury. Yeah.
feeding those philosophers, right? And so I think that, so Aristotle, of course, lived in a time where, where you needed to have slaves, essentially. And to some extent, like, we have this in our economy. I mean, like, so I live in Princeton, and you know who are the people who are doing the real work? I mean, the people that work in the restaurants and on the main street. And those are, Mexicans, Guatemalans, Central Americans, you know majority of town residents, is mostly white, some Asian. None of those people are doing that kind of work, right?
Mhm.
um well, except there's, Chinese restaurants, I guess they do have Chinese workers. But um yeah, so we still have this, like, stratification system that's happening in our economy. Uh but I think that, as the technology gets better, I think, you know like, imagine, like, you have like two columns of people, right? So in the one column you have the workers, and then in the other column you have the consumers, so to speak. And um I guess the challenge is, like, how can you transfer more of these workers into the consumer column? I don't know. But this is just my view, and of course, you don't have to agree with that perspective. And uh, but uh, okay, so let's go back to your area of expertise. So you have Amazon, which creates these warehouses, and they focus on, like, wealthy areas, and areas as close to highways and airports. And so the and at the same time they're trying to avoid the sales tax, and then they couldn't do that anymore because they kept building more warehouses.
Mhm.
um and so now they're receiving tax breaks. So what's been the operating logic of the company? And obviously they have been successful in what they were doing, right? But how is it harmful to the community?
Well, so okay, so I'm actually now responsible for the Amazon work at our organization. I don't know how I got. I don't even remember how I started just doing the story map. I think it was it was a project from before I arrived at the organization, but somehow got dropped because no one was doing it anymore. And so I was the one to pick it up. But anyways, so um, someone in my organization maintains a list of all the subsidies that Amazon has gotten in the states. But we also looked a little bit internationally. But like right now, it's like kind of just in the states we have tabulated over $4 billion, and so we were involved in this coalition. I think it's called Athena, which is comprised of different type of groups who are fighting Amazon on sort of multiple fronts, or sort of demanding that if Amazon comes to the neighborhood, they need to do this, this, and that. And there's people concerned with the environment. There's people concerned with the job quality and the wage, and there are people concerned with immigration, like those uh I don't know, those cameras uh that they use to I don't know, but sometimes I don't remember what exactly the technology is, but it could be used to identify undocumented immigrants by the ICE. So there are people who are concerned about that, about the privacy, about the monopoly and antitrust. So it's kind of just uh, very diverse group of people. And since I'm not like part of I'm not really in charge of Amazon work. I haven't been on their weekly calls or whatever. But so this is kind of like the extent of my knowledge um, on the issue. And of course, during the pandemic, there's like the safety of the workers, and how a bunch of them got sick. And I remember there was a group who are trying to map um what were they. Oh, I wish I remembered these things better, but it's like they were sort of mapping the spread of COVID, and overlay that with the demographics of the region, and sort of finding out where the workers actually live. And um and they found like some like these racial disparities and all that. So I guess that's what as far as I know.
Right. We know, for instance, that yeah, the so if you do COVID infection rate by race, I would say that blacks and Hispanics were disproportionately affected, um, and I would think that one of the reasons is that they were underrepresented in occupations in which social distancing was possible. So if you work as a like what you and I are doing, of course you could just do it from your computer anywhere.
Yeah,
So you do it at home. So you had less exposure to other people.
that's right.
And yeah. So but if you work, fast food restaurants or warehouses and things like that,
Receptionists or
yeah, so these are
public
direct.
facing. Yeah.
Yeah, but then well, if a receptionist, I mean, actually, so if you look at the biggest job cuts that happened at the beginning of the pandemic,
Is it receptionist? Because a lot of places closed.
yeah, exactly. It's like leisure, hospitality, travel, so like hotels and airlines.
Yeah.
They were actually all shutting down, and these people were furloughed, actually. Um, and if you look at like the job gains that were happening, almost all of the job gains come from that very same sector that lost a lot of the jobs, right? Because that's where a lot of the pent up demand is, right? Because people want to go on vacation, people want to do in person conferences again, all these other things.
Hmm.
So those jobs are the ones that are coming back. But it's like I guess like the states they came up with like this essential worker category, right? And I mean I know my mother. I mean like she's like in the supermarket. Like that would be like essential work, right? So that would be done. Um, and yeah, so there's you know different kinds of workers is that where you just couldn't stay home basically, and they would be much more exposed to the virus. And that's a big
Yeah.
problem. And so your major work is about um, you know tax abatements and school funding. And so what's the link there between these two phenomena?
Um, well, I mean, schools depend a lot on property taxes to operate, and when you abate taxes, you're potentially, imposing like some sort of opportunity cost, right? Um, so this is revenue that could have been collected, but wasn't. And so what I'm doing right now is just to try to find the link um, between tax abatements and sort of like school funding and as well as educational quality, because it's rarely been done, mainly because tax payment data is so hard to pin down. And of course, a lot of things affect school funding. Tax abatement is just one piece of it, because you also have like some schools are being helped by the state foundation formula, and other are able to raise taxes and raise their tax rate or expand their property tax base. So there are a lot of things that go into it, but I want to show, because from what I hear, because we've been talking to a lot of people, all sorts of different people, school district financial officers, treasurers, teachers unions, school boards, school board members, and also like just state level sort of associations. Like we're talking about, we've talked to like a lot of different people. I like me and this intern that's working for us this summer, and um, trying to learn sort of qualitatively what is the impact on school districts. And so I believe that this impact is somewhere, even if it cannot be measured directly in the school funding, because of all these like offsetting mechanisms to make up for this tax abatement. But the thing is, like someone is paying for these tax abatements, right? So um, so what I'm also doing is trying to pin down like where the cost shows up.
Yeah, and so overall, I think the issue is that okay, well, so who is getting the tax abatement? I mean, so are these like is it about luring in new residents? I mean, or is it about businesses, big corporations that try to set up shop in the locality?
Mostly the latter. So there are residential tax abatements, but those aren't as common. So mostly it's like these commercial type of tax abatements where you sign an agreement as the government or some agency that has the power to abate taxes. You sign an agreement with a business and lay out the terms, and they don't pay taxes. And there are a lot of different ways where taxes can be avoided by these companies, and it's kind of so it's kind of a lot of some of these really just don't make sense. Why you would need to subsidize a particular company when they either don't need it or they're doing such a bad job of living up to their end of the bargain of creating jobs. And so yeah, so we fight on these fronts with research, with evidence, to try to fight some of these really really bad uh, tax abatements.
Right. So now, I mean, so if I was sort of like a left wing academic, which I sort of would be part of that group, um, I would just say, "Oh my God, this is horrendous. We have to tax these big corporations. We have to fund public schools. We have to hire more teachers. All these other things." But now, but imagine if I was like a city mayor, or if I was a county official or a state official. Um, like if I was, Governor Cuomo or Mayor De Blasio, um, would I have done the same in luring the HQ to Amazon, right? Like giving them tax breaks, and making sure that they set up shop in my place, where it's like 50,000 jobs. Um, and there's a multiplier effect, right? Because if you add 50,000, middle class, upper middle class jobs, then by definition you're adding tens of thousands of, you could say, working class jobs. Think of the people like the transportation workers, or restaurants, like different, like personal care services, things like that. um so maybe, yeah, with the multiplier effect, I mean, 80 to 100,000 jobs, maybe, let's say. Would I have given out the tax abatement? Yeah, I think I would have done it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's that's definitely like a good outcome if you can achieve that, like the job creation goals, if that actually materializes. And I think for a government official, that's definitely an achievement, if you can manage to create this many jobs. But I think the one argument against that would be this economist, Tim Bartik, was currently with the Upjohn Institute. He did this really fancy thing, where he showed that only like incentives only affect about 25% of the location decisions. So most of the time, a firm's location is not affected by incentives. So in which case, you may as well just not just leave it alone and let them choose where they want to be. And I mean, Virginia is okay. So we spoke with this person, who was he worked in Louisiana for a very long time, but then he's with the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. I think that's what it stands for, VEDP. That's the agency that gives out the abatements. And basically, he told us a lot of sort of like the behind the scenes story of how they were able to win Amazon. And a lot of the things kind of don't have a whole lot to do with incentive. And as you know, Virginia's incentive package was like one of the small ones. And but he said one of the main reasons was that the way Virginia has been developing in the last few decades really matched what Amazon needed. Um, so specific examples like, um, sort of these sort of like certain zoning choices, complete streets, and the kind of stuff that makes neighborhoods like attractive, and it's the way they sort of developed, like already developing like with these concepts in mind, having things be walkable and having this next to that, and stuff like this is what Amazon really liked. I think I took a screenshot of the slide that he showed us as potential explanation for why Amazon's HQ2 project experienced different reactions in New York and Virginia, because in New York there was a huge backlash, and that's why they withdrew. And so yeah, so there's all these list of reasons, including like this sort of uh, extensive engagement between the leaders in Virginia and and sort of like being very open and about the whole process, and but also that HQ2 scale and design is consistent with the existing community growth plans in Arlington, sort of high density mixed use and transit oriented development. And
Yeah. So, did you read the book by Alec McGillis? So, pull it up here. So, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One Click America, and it was published earlier this year.
oh
And
no, I the
what
one that I know is Amazon Unbound or something like that.
there's probably tons of books is published now about the company, but anyway, McGillis' argument about the North Virginia area. So, there's two reasons. The first is, they already have data centers in Northern Virginia,
Mhm.
because they basically bought up huge plots of land, and the biggest revenue earner in Amazon is AWS, like the Amazon Web Services. Almost every company, like even I'm in Princeton. I mean, we use that up here, right? Um, so that of course takes up a lot of space, and um, It's like it's close to existing Amazon infrastructure, so it's easier to build there. And the second reason, actually, I think is more important, which is that as the company becomes more and more powerful and rich, um, having political protection from Washington D.C. Becomes more important as well. So
That's a good
um,
point.
yeah. So they're servicing the DC area, of course, which by itself is a big market, but also like Amazon lobbying spending has increased in Washington for sure. Um, and it's really about having all of that stuff close by is very important. And so yeah, so basically like the only choices would have been those two locations, either DC area or New York City, right? And Yeah, so New York City didn't become that for political reasons. Um, you know,
I think one serious contender was Atlanta, if I remember correctly. Like there were a few cities that were like maybe the finalists. I don't know. That had a shot. Because a lot of times like according to that guy from VDP, like there were times when they weren't sure that they were gonna win. Like it wasn't until the very end because like there was radio silence from Amazon for like weeks, if not months, and so they actually thought they were like out of the running, and they consider like these their competitors seriously. They know some cities don't have really much of a shot in some of the finalists, and this is. But I think I remember he's one of the contenders, Atlanta.
yeah. But I mean, but still, I think the overall issue seems to be, if you are a municipality, like, do you feel like you're obligated to give the tax breaks? And you see, like, even if you cite research that says, well, that's only true in 25% of cases, and 75% of cases it doesn't work like that. You know, as a government official, like, how do you know that for that specific company, the 75% principle applies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So and that's really what the issue is. That, okay, like, if you sort of want to put a stop to that race to the bottom competition between jurisdictions,
Mhm.
um, you would basically need some federal law where you say, um, no, there's only a standard package, and you can only negotiate that with the federal government, right? Like a standard, you could say, tax abatement package, if if that's what's part of it. Um, and and you basically prohibit municipalities and states even to do this competition, right?
I think the federal government is never going to take on that kind of a role. Um, so right now there is a multi-state compact conversation that's going on.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
that's possible too. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So, but I don't know how far along it is, or what states are open to being part of this compact. And but what has happened is Kansas and Missouri signed a truce, sort of like saying nobody can pay companies to jump across the border in the Kansas City area. So that's good, and a lot of the same sort of like different places that share the same sort of labor market, if they can all do that and sort of eliminate that kind of competition first, that would be good. And as for the incentive to offer incentives, um, so one disturbing trend is or pattern is that like poorer places tend to be more desperate for jobs, and so kind of ironically they are the ones that might give out more tax revenues because they really want the companies to be there, versus like more well-to-do places, they can afford to be more selective. They could say, oh, we don't want you this type of company here, like, and they can say that, and sort of companies have to like try to get in here, and so that's kind of one source of like regional disparity that we're seeing.
Right. I mean, but still, I think those poorer regions, municipalities, I think, yeah, they would benefit the most from prohibiting this kind of competition, right? Um, you know,
Yes.
right. So we would have to support them in some way, and then maybe the companies will settle there. But I mean, overall, I mean, and we discussed this in the case of China. I mean, the rural-urban inequality, which is a big driver for migration, and the same process happens in any big capitalist country, right? Um, where you know a lot of the value-added activities um, happen in the big cities, um, and then that by itself attracts a lot of people. And so it's an economic argument, but then the economic argument becomes a cultural argument for why cities are attractive, right? Because in New York City you have Broadway, and you have good restaurants, different cultures, everything together. Um, yeah, so culturally, economically, this like the big cities become the major source of attraction, and but then from a you could say from a community social justice kind of standpoint, what you want to do is you want to spread the wealth geographically, right? So you would want to make sure that the smaller, mid-sized, second, third tier cities are, you know, well, I mean, they don't have to be like thriving in the same way as as the first tier cities, but they would have to do well enough. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, yes, investment is important, or attracting investment. The okay, I just lost my train of thought. But I think it's just like again, tax incentives is solely focused on just getting a company here. That's just too narrow. So like it kind of focus on just like the only the growth indicators. And so what a lot of groups are interested in now is community benefit agreements. So negotiate better terms on the community benefit agreements, so that when a company comes and gets all these incentives, there's a more broad sort of like benefit for all residents, and have a more sort of comprehensive focus rather than sort of very narrow job and investment focus. So that's what a lot of people have been asking, like when we meet with them. Yeah, but as for school district, so like my focus right now is on school district, right? And it's kind of a different story because school district is kind of in a very awkward place in economic development and community development. So, um, and in the case that so right now we're focusing on Ohio, where the municipalities depend mostly on income taxes and school district depends a lot on property taxes, and the municipality abates the school district's property tax because it like they're essentially spending someone else's money because they don't really need it as much. And so when it's that kind of arrangement, accountability could be not guaranteed because it's like there's less to lose for the municipality, which
so the
which are
city wants to cut the property taxes
yeah. So
because they don't rely on the property tax money to fund the city operations.
exactly. So cities abate property taxes, and we were speaking just yesterday with this woman who has been fighting against tax payments and tax increment financing districts in Cincinnati for the past 7 years as part of grassroots movement that consists of a lot of different sort of groups like the homeless, the parents, and she's also running for city council. Third time, she was very close to winning the first couple of times, but she is very very serious about it, um, and she told us about these a lot of really outrageous sort of uh, exploiting the loopholes type of thing, such as building on port authority property which is tax exempt, um, or like the exemption is supposed to only last 1 year, but they repeatedly like renew this lease indefinitely. So, so then it became like 32 years of like not paying property taxes, and it's just a little insane.
Right. I mean, and I guess the implication for the school district. So I mean, I must assume like they can't really choose what the level of property tax is, even though they would be the ones that are affected
Right.
by these changes.
Yeah. So they like it kind of depends on who you're asking, because we also spoke with some school districts that are doing quite well and they're happy with the arrangements because they kind of get their revenue back from the state foundation formula and the payment in lieu of taxes, and so um, but then you have like when you hear, usually it's the teachers unions that are really uh, are the ones pushing back against tax payments because their teachers are not getting the raises that they need, and they also see how a lot of classroom conditions. We've heard this many times that the classroom conditions are terrible. There's no internet, there's no AC, so they have to cut the number of school days. That there's mold, that there's like roof is leaking,
Mm.
and these are a lot of poor school districts, and where a lot of taxes are being diverted to like for these corporate tax breaks, and so it's, you could say that the tax break eventually will pay itself off in the form um, of increased property tax overall, or maybe in like 20 years when a company resume paying taxes, and like maybe, but but kids right now are suffering, and so there needs to be a solution to that.
Right. I mean, and right, it's basically about the big political economy question, which is who gets to have the money, right? So if
Yeah.
you're like a teacher or if you're like a student, um, I think you would be sort of low in the totem pole, right? And if you are a so-called job creator, right? If you're like a business owner, you would be at the top of the totem pole. And the justification, like if I was sort of like the mayor or the um, state official, I would say, yeah, because the businesses, they create the jobs and the taxes. I mean, it's sort of like the in a capitalist society. I mean, it's like the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? And I mean, it's a very weird. I mean, like if you abstract from that, I think it is a weird form of reasoning, because you could also say that, like, if you don't invest in your children, right,
Hmm.
and if they drop out of school, or if they can make it to like good quality jobs, maybe the crime rate increases in the future, or opiate addiction, whatever social problems that were caused by underinvestment early
Right.
on. So
So that kind of undermines it's some kind of like yeah. So like if you don't guarantee these basic things first, like it's not gonna make your place more attractive to businesses if there's all these like if there are all these problems, including like a lack of skilled workforce, for example. So I mean, anyway, so we were not like, of course we're not against all tax abatements. It's just like we emphasize that our core mission is to just like improve transparency and accountability, because like sometimes companies rewrite, like governments rewrite the terms of their agreements. So for example, a company promised to get, five to create 500 jobs, and then in a couple of years it looks like that's not happening. They rewrite the agreement to lower it to like 20 jobs, and but they get the still get the same amount of tax breaks. If the government doesn't require clawbacks, that doesn't claw back this money, then then the company still enjoys all these tax benefits. But like the and I was just reading this article like by this Texas what is it, some university in Texas, this professor, but he's like really active on this thing. His name's Nate Jensen, I think. I think he just wrote a paper showing that the it's called "Who's Afraid of Sunshine" or something, and shows that the companies that are very secretive or non-transparent, or challenge public record requests, are the ones that have rewritten the the contract, the deal with the city. Um, so anyway, so those are the kind of things that, so first they gotta be transparent so that the public can evaluate, like whether the programs are actually working. If they are, then that's fine. But if they're not, then we need to get rid of them or change them. And the other thing is accountability, so the companies to actually do what they say they're going to do. Otherwise, they have to pay back all the benefits they got. So it's just mainly those two things that we're concerned with.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that would be, the right way of going about it. I think, companies, if they do get a tax benefit, I think they should, um they should at least deliver. um and yeah, it's ultimately, I guess, the goal for you, I mean, from a teleology perspective, is to create more of a balance. I mean, I think, like, between, basically corporate actors and everybody else in society. And I think, it's really difficult, to do that kind of thing. I mean, um if you take, for instance, the environment, right? You know because we have to, suck more natural resources out of the ground, right, in order to operate our vehicles, in order to run our agriculture, industrial production, etc., etc. And these companies are profiting wonderfully from it. Um, so it's a great short-term benefit, which, from a consumer perspective, is reflected in, our high standard of living, right? But but we are ultimately paying the bill for it, um, because because the climate is just getting warmer. I mean, like, so in your area, I guess in Vancouver, and was, and also Seattle, right, in northwest U.S., was hit very badly by a heat wave.
Well, fortunately, I'm not living there now, but yeah, I heard about the heat wave and how a lot of people living there didn't have air conditioner,
Yeah,
air
air conditioning. Yeah, AC. Yeah.
because they never needed it. And, so they really just weren't prepared for the heat wave, and a lot of them have to go outside, stay outside to cool down.
Yeah, I also read the article. So I grew up in Vienna, in Austria, and it's usually not that hot in the summer, but now they say like 35 Celsius, and they prohibited grilling outside,
Hmm.
because it's basically the air is and the ground is so dry
Oh
that they fear wildfire. Even small, like timber fires, gonna result in big fires.
wow, that's serious.
Yeah, yeah, and this is a very strange situation, right? And we're seeing that happening almost everywhere. I mean, it's like couple of days ago I saw in the northern Norway, which is the most northern point in Europe. Um, yeah, also like it was like 35 Celsius, and completely unusual. I mean, like this is an area that, you know, the warmest would be 15, 20, something like that. Um, and yeah, so I think the changes that, and this is not just like, Jeff Bezos, big corporations, evil. I think, I think that would be too easy. I think this is an indictment of society essentially, and the fact that like the cost of climate change is also very uneven, right? So, like I read recently in Madagascar, um, an island nation where they're suffering from hunger catastrophe because of a drought, and that country barely contributed anything to CO2 production globally, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's like you don't produce the CO2, so you have a low standard of living, and then at the same time you're the ones that have the least protection against the changes to the climate. Um,
I mean, that kind of shows like just the interconnectedness of different regions, and the effect is of it's like it's felt somewhere, even if it's not like the felt by whoever is incurred this like sort of damage or harm. And that's interesting too because there are a lot of like tax incentives for these kind of clean energy companies, and so that's kind of an area where things get more thorny. Uh, um, like the person yesterday from Cincinnati was saying how they fought against tax abatements for a very long time, and in the end, all the city got rid of is tax abatements for LED uh, properties. So like and so
LED properties, what's that all about?
I think it's some kind of like when your building like meets certain type of standard. Let me see what it stands for.
So it's
Uh,
about some
energy.
environmental regulation that
Yeah,
you submit to
yeah, it's like kind of like how the buildings
a building code.
designed like that emits like less CO2 or takes less energy, and yeah, and so so then the environmental people were very unhappy about that. So um yeah.
So
um
what's the problem with LED houses?
um I mean that's the thing because they want to reduce tax avoidance like these groups, but then but the lead buildings are really not their priority. So and then that's the thing that's the victory that they won. So um, and I don't know this issue too well. I only heard like anecdotes and people mentioning because there's also like a lot of clean energy companies in upstate New York that are getting a lot of tax exemptions, and obviously they're good, um but they are not paying a lot of taxes. So there's that contention there as well.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not just on the tax abatement front. I think there's also this issue of like, if you're like a green company, how green are you really? So there was this documentary by Michael Moore, and I think it was titled Planet of the Humans. And yeah, so he was basically investigating, um, you know, well, there were two main examples. So the first was, when Chevrolet GM was presenting their electric car, which is a Chevy Volt, and they said, look at so they invited a corporate PR person, and he said, well, look at how great it is that we're not emitting any gases and fumes into the atmosphere. And then the reporter was basically asking, well, what about the electricity grid? Where does that come from? And he's like, well, it comes from whatever the municipality, the municipal grid. And then, well, if the municipal grid gets its electricity from burning fossil fuels, that I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, where's the net benefit ultimately, right, to the environment?
Mhm.
That's the first problem. And then the second problem, so like there's in Biden administration, and in California they do that now, where they basically mandate all new vehicles starting from next decade to be electric. So basically, it's a phasing out of combustion engine. And now the thing is that electric cars, you need the lithium
Mhm.
in order to produce the batteries, because the lithium basically stores the energy, the charge, right?
Yeah.
And then the thing is, so, okay, so where do you get it from? So you get it from China, you get it from South America, like Chile and Argentina and those places, and and also in, I think, in Nevada, I think they're starting a lithium mine. And the problem is always the same. It's like you go to an area where there's lots of indigenous people that live there, and then you basically have to throw them out of the land, or you just have to push them a little bit to the side, and and then you have to soil the environment. You have to um, the groundwater. I mean, going back to your earlier research, um, get gets polluted as a result of mining operations. And I mean, like, what this tells me is, like, even the things that is green, like that looks good, that sound good. I mean, they're not cost free, right? Um,
Right.
it's like, to me, the only cost free solution is the one that we're not allowed to talk about in the capitalist system, which is less consumption.
Yeah.
It's like, basically people saying, oh, why have electric cars in the first place? Why not just move less? So it's things like that. I don't know.
Mhm.
Um, and that's sort of that's going to be the really hard transition, I would say, to make. And it links back to an earlier point about, you know should the meaning of life come from work? Where it's like, I would say that actually, if we work more, aren't we also polluting more to the environment? Like, aren't we destroying, like, in our puritanical obsession with wage labor? I mean, aren't we, you know degrading the environment further? So
That's interesting. That's kind of like the uh this the like this triangular, we talk about this triangular model in like planning, where like all these goals like sort of conflict. I can't remember what who proposed it. Is this Scott Campbell or someone else? I can't remember, but it's like the sort of like it's the what you think about sustainability, like the triangular model, and then on the vertices you have like the environment, economy, and equity or whatever, and then the sides are like the conflict between like sort of these three things. And when you have like and sometimes there is conflict between like environment and equity as well, which is kind of surprising. It's not something we usually think about. It's not something that we usually discuss in policy. Um, but anyway, so I'm sorry, but I do have to hop off in a couple minutes. Um, but like this has been a really,
well,
really
I
interesting
think I've kept you here for too long,
conversation.
so thank you, Christine, for
Oh no, not at all.
joining
It's
me in that
yeah, but
podcast.
I really enjoyed this conversation, and think there's a lot of stuff to think about after this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be thought about.